Section 5.4, Day 2 of Special Parallelograms. Objective still the same as yesterday. We're going to apply the definitions and identify the special properties of a rectangle, a rhombus, and a square. And we're going to determine when a parallelogram is a rectangle, a rhombus, or a square. So here is your class opener. If M is the midpoint of AB, find the following. Quadrilateral MORE is a square. If ME is 7x minus 3, so let's write that in. ME is 7x minus 3, and MO is 6x. Find the value of x. Well, I know that all the sides of a square are congruent, so I can just set 7x minus 3 equal to 6x and solve. So I'm going to subtract 7x on each side, and I get negative 3 equals negative x, which means that positive 3 should equal positive x, and x is 3. Number 2, if MT is 4x, so let's get rid of what's up here. So MT is 4x. TE is 3x plus 2. Find OE. Well, I know that the diagonals of the square are congruent because the square is a rectangle. I know that the diagonals bisect each other for a square because a square is also a rhombus. So I know that MT and TE are going to be congruent to one another, so I can set them equal to each other. So 4x equals 3x plus 2. Subtract 3x on each side, and I get that x equals 2. Now, this problem wanted me to find OE. So what's the length from O to E? So if I look in the diagram, I can figure out the length from E to T by just substituting the value of 2 for x. If I substitute 2 in for x, I get 3 times 2, which is 6, plus 2 is 8. I know that the diagonals happen to bisect each other, so I know that TO is also 8. So the length from O to E is going to be 16. Segment XW is a median of triangle XYZ. So median means it goes from the vertex to the midpoint of the opposite side. So I know that W is the midpoint, so ZW is congruent to YW, and since this is a right triangle, I know that the midpoint of the hypotenuse is equidistant from all the vertices, so those segments are also congruent to WX. So let's see, number 1. If measure of angle 2 equals measure of angle 3, find the measure of angle 1. Well, the measure of angle 2 is congruent to the measure of angle 3. Well, if I happen to look at this triangle, I notice that 2 sides are congruent, which means the 2 angles are congruent, which are the angles across from those congruent sides, which means angle 2 should be congruent to angle 4 because it's an isosceles triangle. Now I notice that it's actually an equilateral triangle, which means that all of the angles should be 60 degrees. And if I'm trying to find out what's the measure of angle 1, well, I have a triangle where one angle is 90, another angle is 60, and I can take 180 degrees minus 90 minus 60, and I would be left with 30. So the measure of angle 1 is 30. Number 2, let's clear off our diagram. If YW is 3x minus 2 and WZ is x plus 8, I'm supposed to find YZ. Well, I know that XW is the median, so I still know that these two segments are congruent to each other. So let's set them equal to each other. So I get 3x minus 2 equals x plus 8. Subtract x on each side, and you get 2x minus 2 equals 8. Add 2 to each side, and you get 2x equals 10. Divide by 2, x is 5. And now if I'm looking for yz, the entire length from y to z, well, let's substitute 5 back in. 5 plus 8 is 13. I know the other piece, wy, should be the same, but let's substitute it in just to double check. If I substitute in 5, I get 3 times 5, which is 15. 15 minus 2 is 13, so everything looks good. Now add them together, and I get that yz should be 26. Number 3. If measure of angle 1 equals 40, so we'll fill that in. Find measure of angle 2, measure of angle 3, and the measure of angle 4. Well, if I know that the measure of angle 1 is 40, I again know that I have a large right triangle where angle 1, 4, and 2 have to add up to 180. So if I take 180 minus 40 minus 90, I'll be left with 50. So angle 2 is going to be 50. If I remember back from the beginning, I knew that this is the midpoint of the hypotenuse, so these 3 segments are all congruent to one another. If I look at this triangle right here, I know it's going to be an isosceles triangle. I know that angle 2 has to be congruent to angle 4, so angle 4 is also going to have to be 50. I know that the 3 angles inside of a triangle have to add up to 180. So 180 minus 50 leaves me with 80. So that would give me that the measure of angle 2 was 50. The measure of angle 3 was 80. And the measure of angle 4 was 50. Given a rectangle QRST, parallelograms RKST and JQST, prove segments JT congruent to segment KS. Right. So we have ourselves a proof, so we know that we start off with our 2 columns, statements and reasons. We know our first step is always just restating the given. So we have rectangle QRST, parallelogram RKST, and JQST. And that is all given. All right, now let's look at that in the actual diagram. So I know that QRST is a rectangle. So QRST is a rectangle. I know that RKST and JQST are both parallelograms. So let's see where they are. RKST, so there's a parallelogram, and JQST happens to be another parallelogram. And I need to eventually show that segment JT is going to be congruent to segment KS. All right, well, how can that happen? Well, if I look at the parallelograms, I know that opposite sides of parallelograms are congruent. And the opposite sides of the parallelograms happen to be the diagonals inside of the rectangle, and I know that the diagonals of a rectangle are congruent. So let's start to write that information down. So in the green parallelogram, I know that segment JT is going to be congruent to segment QS. And the reason is opposite sides of a parallelogram are congruent, and this is actually step 2. So opposite sides of a parallelogram are congruent. And that's going to be the same reasoning in the blue triangle, that segment SK is going to be congruent to segment TR, because they are also opposite sides. And now if I look in the rectangle, I know that segment TR is going to be congruent to segment SQ. And the reason is diagonals of a rectangle are congruent. Well, now I can just use the transitive property to get segment JT congruent to segment KS. And your closure question for today: what was the most confusing topic covered today?